He ran the most feared criminal empire in South Korea, and a 3-year-old girl with a paintbrush brought him to his knees. Han Seo-jin had made killers tremble, politicians bow, and traitors disappear without a trace. But on one gray morning in his own sitting room, he woke to find a butterfly on his forehead, a rainbow across his nose, and a toddler whispering that lonely people needed color. He pretended to sleep to test her. What she did broke something open in him that 12 years of blood and betrayal had sealed shut. This is the story of a man who trusted no one, and the little girl who taught him why that had to change. Rain fell on the reinforced glass of the estate's east wing, streaking down in thin silver lines that caught the light from the security monitors. Inside the consultation room, 4 men stood in silence while a 5th knelt on the black marble floor. Han Seo-jin did not raise his voice. He never did. "Explain the discrepancy in the Busan manifest," he said, his tone as level as a man discussing the weather. The kneeling man was Yoon Tae-sik, a mid-level lieutenant who had managed port logistics for 6 years. Sweat had soaked through the collar of his shirt. His hands trembled against his knees. "Sir, it was an accounting error, a clerical mistake. I can fix it by." "You skimmed 11% from the container fees for 14 months, Seo-jin said. "That is not an accounting error. That is a decision," repeated 14 times. Dong-hwan, standing at Seo-jin's right shoulder, held a tablet with the full ledger displayed. He did not look at Tae-sik. He looked only at Seo-jin, waiting. "I have children," Tae-sik said. "My daughter needs surgery. I was going to pay it back." "You should have asked me," Seo-jin said. "I would have paid for the surgery myself. Instead, you stole from the organization that protects your family, and you gambled that I would never notice." The silence stretched. Somewhere beyond the reinforced glass, the wind pushed rain sideways across the mountain ridge. "What happens now?" Tae-sik whispered. "You will not die," Seo-jin said, and something in the room exhaled, though no one moved. "You will lose everything you built here. Your access, your title, your territory. You will leave Seoul tonight, and you will not return. Your daughter's surgery will be paid for, because children do not deserve to suffer for their father's failures. But you will never work in this business again, in this city or any other where my name carries weight." Tae-sik's face crumpled with something between relief and devastation. Dong-hwan moved forward to escort him out, and the room emptied of everyone except Seo-jin, who remained standing at the window, watching the rain. This was how he ruled. Not with rage, not with theater, with precision and with a kind of mercy so calculated it felt colder than cruelty. Men who worked for Han Seo-jin knew 2 things absolutely. He would know everything about them eventually, and he would never punish beyond what the crime required. It made him more terrifying than any boss who ruled by fear alone, because fear built on unpredictability could be gambled against. Fear built on certainty could not. He had learned this the hard way. 12 years ago, his father, Han Yoon-tae, had built the first version of the Haniel Syndicate on friendship and old loyalty. He trusted the men who had grown up with him in the docks of Incheon, men who called him brother, men who ate at his table every Chuseok. One of those men, a man Seo-jin had called uncle since childhood, had sold his father's location to a rival family for a price that Seo-jin even now refused to say aloud. His father had been shot 4 times in a restaurant bathroom, alone, while Seo-jin waited at a table 20 feet away. 24 years old and still believing the world operated on the same loyalty his father had taught him. He had rebuilt everything from that wreckage. Not on friendship, on systems, on tests, on the belief that trust was not a gift to be given but a fortress to be earned, brick by brick, over years. And even then it could crumble in a single night. His estate reflected this philosophy in stone. Built into the mountain ridge above Seoul, it was a structure of black granite and reinforced glass, its corridors monitored by cameras that fed into a security room Dong-hwan checked personally every 4 hours. Every room had a purpose. Every door had a reason for being locked. Guests were rare. Family visits were non-existent, because there was no family left. He lived there alone, surrounded by staff who came and went on rotating contracts. None of them permitted to stay long enough to learn the rhythms of his life too intimately. He had not truly laughed in years. He could not remember the last time. Smiles, yes. Thin, controlled things he deployed at business dinners to disarm men he intended to outmaneuver. But laughter, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded, had died with his father in that restaurant bathroom. He believed this was simply what it cost to survive. He had made peace with the price. He did not yet know that peace was about to be interrupted by a woman from Atlanta and her daughter's paintbrush. The old housekeeper, A quiet woman named Miss Cho, who had served the estate for 6 years, retired to care for her ailing mother in Daegu. Dong Hwan handled the replacement search personally, as he handled everything that touched the household's security perimeter. He brought the file to Seo Jin's office on a Tuesday morning, laying it flat on the desk without commentary, waiting for permission to speak. "Her name is Maya Brooks," Dong Hwan said once Seo Jin had opened the folder. "American, from Atlanta, Georgia, 32 years old. She has been in South Korea for 14 months. Certified in private household management through an agency in the United States. Additional certification completed here for domestic service standards. Her references are strong. 2 prior employers, both satisfied, both willing to speak on her behalf." Seo Jin scanned the photograph clipped to the top page. A woman with steady eyes and an unreadable expression, the kind of face that gave nothing away in a photograph taken for administrative purposes. Why did she leave the United States? The father of her daughter left behind significant debt to people who do not use banks, Dong Hwan said. She relocated to put distance between her child and the collectors. She has a daughter, 3 years old. Name is Lila. Seo Jin's eyes moved down the page. Financially fragile. Yes. Childcare arrangement? Unstable. She has used a rotating combination of a neighbor and a part-time daycare service. Neither has proven reliable. Seo Jin closed the folder. That is her problem, not mine. She understands the terms of employment do not accommodate a child on the premises. She has been informed. She has agreed to the terms. Then proceed. Maya Brooks arrived on a Thursday morning, 15 minutes before her scheduled start time. Dressed in a simple dark uniform she had clearly pressed herself the night before. She carried no bag beyond a small tote with a water bottle and a folded umbrella, and she stood at the gate with the posture of someone who had learned, through long practice, to appear calm regardless of what waited behind a door. Dong Hwan walked her through the estate on her first day, reciting the rules in the flat, efficient tone he used for all security briefings. No entry to the north wing without express permission. No photographs, ever, of any room or any person. All deliveries logged and inspected. All schedule changes reported 24 hours in advance except in emergencies. Maya listened without asking a single unnecessary question. She did not ask why the north wing was restricted. She did not ask about the armed men stationed at the gate, or the cameras in every corridor, or the late-night vehicles that sometimes arrived after midnight and left before dawn. She absorbed the rules the way a person absorbs the terms of a contract they intend to honor completely, because honoring it was the only way to keep what mattered to her safe. Within a week, she had learned the rhythms of the house more precisely than the housekeeper before her had managed in a month. She reorganized the pantry to reduce waste. She learned which staff took their coffee black and which took it sweet, and she remembered without being told twice. She treated the armed guards at the gate with the same brisk courtesy she extended to the senior men who visited Seo Jin's office, neither fawning nor cold, simply professional, in a way that unsettled people accustomed to being either feared or flattered. Seo Jin, for the first 2 weeks, barely registered her as a person. She was a function of the house, like the security system or the climate control. He passed her in corridors and nodded once, the way he nodded at furniture that had been recently rearranged. He did not know yet that she watched rooms the way survivors watch rooms, cataloging exits, memorizing faces, filing away small details that might matter later. He did not know she was quietly, constantly protecting a version of safety that had nothing to do with his approval and everything to do with a 3-year-old girl sleeping in a small rented apartment across the city. He would learn. The call came on a Monday morning, early enough that mist still clung to the mountain ridge outside the estate's windows. "Mr. Han," Maya said, when Dong Hwan patched the call through to Seo Jin's private line, a courtesy she had not expected and clearly had not asked for. "I apologize for the imposition. My daughter's daycare had a pipe burst overnight. It's closed for repairs, and my usual backup, my neighbor, is out of the city until tomorrow. I have no one else to call." Seo Jin said nothing for a moment, turning the problem over in his mind the way he turned over every unexpected variable, searching for the angle, the risk, the cost. "I understand if this is not something you can accommodate," Maya continued, and there was no pleading in her voice, only the flat practicality of someone who had learned not to waste emotion on things she could not control. "I can take an unpaid day if needed. I only wanted to ask directly rather than simply not show up." That, more than anything, was what made Seo Jin pause. She had not lied. She had not invented an excuse. She had called the most dangerous man in Seoul and told him the truth about a burst pipe and a missing neighbor, prepared to accept whatever consequence followed. "Bring her," he said. "One day. She stays in the west sitting room. She does not enter the north wing, the upper floors, or my office. You supervise her at all times. If this arrangement causes any disruption, it will not be repeated." "Understood. Thank you, sir." She arrived 2 hours later with Lila's small hand in hers, and the child was already a production of color against the black stone corridors. A red backpack nearly as large as her torso, a stuffed giraffe tucked under one arm and a stuffed elephant under the other, yellow rain boots, and a sketch pad clutched against her chest like something precious. Dong-hwan watched them pass through the security checkpoint with an expression of pure, professional alarm, as though someone had smuggled a small, unpredictable animal into a facility built to contain calculated danger. He said nothing, but he flagged the west sitting room's camera feed for closer monitoring, a habit he would maintain, quietly, for weeks. Maya set Lila up in the corner of the west sitting room with the efficiency of a woman who had done this in far less comfortable places. Watercolor paints arranged by color, a jar of water, a stack of thick paper, crayons sorted into a plastic case. Lila approached the setup with the gravity of a surgeon preparing an operating table, humming tunelessly under her breath. Seo-jin, in his office 2 rooms away, was midway through a call with a supplier when the sound reached him. A small voice, off-key, singing something that might have been a nursery rhyme, or might have been entirely invented, drifting faintly through the wall. He stopped mid-sentence. The man on the other end of the call asked if he was still there. "Yes," Seo-jin said, and finished the call in 3 clipped sentences, his attention already elsewhere. He did not go to the sitting room. He told himself there was no reason to. But for the rest of that afternoon, he found his office door slightly more open than usual, and he noticed, with something that felt uncomfortably like curiosity, that the humming continued for nearly 2 hours without interruption. The single day became 2 days a week, then 3, as Maya's childcare situation remained unresolved and Seo-jin, to his own quiet surprise, did not object. He told himself it was efficiency. Maya worked harder when she was not anxious about her daughter's safety, and an anxious employee made mistakes. This was the justification he offered Dong-hwan, who accepted it with a raised eyebrow he was too disciplined to voice aloud. Lila settled into the rhythm of the house the way water settles into the low places of a landscape. Finding every gap the fortress had left unguarded, she painted butterflies in every color she could invent. Purple-winged monarchs, orange swallowtails, a butterfly she insisted was blue on one side and green on the other, because, she explained with great seriousness, some butterflies like to be 2 things at once. One afternoon, walking the corridor between his office and the east consultation room, Seo-jin passed the open door of the west sitting room and found Lila looking directly at him. Paintbrush suspended mid-air, watercolor dripping onto the newspaper Maya had spread beneath her supplies. "Do you want to see?" Lila asked, with no hesitation, no fear, no calculation of what a 3-year-old should or should not say to a man who terrified grown criminals into silence. Seo-jin stopped. He glanced toward Maya, who had gone very still near the window, watching him with the careful neutrality of someone unsure whether she was about to lose her job. He stepped into the room. Lila held up her paper. A butterfly, wings spread wide, orange and black, wobbly at the edges the way all children's paintings are wobbly, and somehow more alive for it. "That's a monarch," Lila announced. "They fly very, very far, all the way to Mexico," my teacher said. "They're small, but they don't get tired because they know where they're going." "That is a long distance for something so small," Seo-jin said, and he was surprised by his own voice, softer than he had used it in years. Lila studied him for a moment, tilting her head the way children do when they are deciding whether an adult deserves further conversation. Then she said with the flat, unguarded honesty of the very young, "You have tired eyes." The room went silent. Maya's hand tightened on the edge of the table. Seo-jin had been looked at by men calculating whether to betray him, by women calculating whether to seduce him, by politicians calculating whether he was worth the risk of association. He had never, in longer than he could remember, been looked at by someone who simply saw that he was tired, and said so without fear, without agenda, without expecting anything in return. "Go back to your painting," he said, and it came out gentler than he intended. Lila shrugged, entirely unbothered, and returned to her butterfly, as though she had not just cracked something open in the chest of the most feared man in Seoul. Seo-jin left the room. He did not mention the exchange to Maya. He did not mention it to anyone. But that night, alone in his office long after the house had gone quiet, he found himself thinking about the phrase again and again. Tired eyes. Not dangerous eyes. Not cold eyes. Just tired, the way anyone's eyes might be tired. The way a person's eyes get tired when they have not slept without listening for danger in longer than they can remember. The underboss negotiation ran 4 hours longer than scheduled. A grinding session over shipping routes with a man named Ryu Sungbei who smiled too much and conceded too little. By the time Seo-jin returned to the main house, his jaw ached from the effort of appearing unbothered, and his patience had worn down to something thin and brittle. He heard the argument before he reached the sitting room. "No, Giraffe, blue is for the SKY, Lila was saying, in the exaggerated, patient tone of someone explaining something very obvious to someone very slow. Grass is green. Everybody knows that. She held the stuffed giraffe up to face her painting, as though awaiting its concession. Seo-jin stood in the corridor for a moment, unseen, and felt something in his chest loosen slightly, the tension of the negotiation draining out of him in a way 4 hours of careful diplomacy had failed to achieve. He continued to the kitchen instead of his office. He was not entirely sure afterward why he did it. He opened the small refrigerator reserved for staff snacks and found a row of apple juice boxes, the kind with the foil lid and the small straw taped to the side, purchased by Maya for Lila's visits. He took one, carried it to the sitting room, and set it beside Lila's watercolor tray without a word, then turned to leave. "Thank you," Lila called after him, already peeling the foil back with the singular focus of a small child pursuing juice. He did not answer. He kept walking, but something in his stride had changed, some fraction of the weight he had carried in from the negotiation lighter than it had been a minute before. He told himself later that it meant nothing. A juice box was not trust. It was not weakness. It was simply a small, meaningless act that had cost him nothing and required nothing in return. But over the following weeks, his office door remained open more often than closed. He found himself listening for the humming, the small arguments with stuffed animals, the sound of a paintbrush tapping against the rim of a water jar. The house, which had been silent for 12 years in a way he had stopped noticing because silence was simply the baseline condition of his life, began to sound less like a mausoleum and more like something that might eventually be called a home. It was not one moment that changed how Seo-jin saw Maya Brooks. It was an accumulation, the way trust always accumulates in a man who has trained himself never to give it freely. Small deposits that built, almost against his will, into something he had to eventually acknowledge. He noticed that she had reorganized the household budget without being asked, cutting waste in the kitchen supply orders by nearly 15%, a fact he confirmed by checking the numbers himself. Unable to quite believe an employee would bother improving efficiency no one had demanded. He noticed that she treated Donghwan's security team with the same brisk respect she showed the senior underbosses who visited for meetings, never fawning, never dismissive, simply professional in a way that made both groups, unusually, respect her in return. He noticed that she never asked him questions she had no right to ask. She never inquired about the locked rooms, the armed guards, the late-night arrivals, the tension that sometimes crackled through the house after a difficult meeting. She observed everything and commented on nothing, the discipline of a woman who understood that some silences were the price of safety. He noticed, most of all, that she never performed gratitude. She did her work well because doing it well was who she was, not because she was angling for his approval or his money or his protection. It was, he realized slowly, the first time in years he had encountered someone in his employ who was not, in some fashion, managing him. The evening it truly shifted was unremarkable in every way except one. Lila had fallen asleep in the corridor outside the west sitting room, exhausted from a long day of painting, curled against Maya's side while Maya finished a final task before their evening departure. Maya lifted the sleeping child carefully, adjusting her weight, and turned to find Seo-jin standing a few feet away, having come from his office to retrieve a file. "She's out cold," Maya said, mostly to herself, shifting Lila's weight against her shoulder. "It's a 20-minute walk to the bus, and I don't want to wake her." "Use the east guest room," Seo-jin said, "until she wakes." Maya's eyes flicked to him, a careful, assessing look, the look of a woman checking for a hidden cost in an offer that seemed too easy. "There's no obligation," he said, reading the hesitation correctly. "The room is empty. It costs nothing to use it." She studied him a moment longer, then nodded. "Thank you." She carried Lila to the guest room and laid her gently on the bed, tucking the stuffed giraffe and elephant on either side of her, and when she returned to the corridor, Seo-jin had already gone, the file retrieved, the offer made and closed without any further comment. It was such a small kindness. It cost him nothing to give, and yet Maya found herself thinking about it on the bus ride home that night, turning it over the way one turns over a coin looking for the counterfeit mark, and finding, to her quiet surprise, none. The overnight negotiation with the Park family ran 7 hours, ending only when the gray light of dawn had begun to seep through the sitting room windows. Seo-jin had not slept in nearly 30 hours by the time the last of the Park representatives left the estate, and he made it only as far as the main sitting room's long leather sofa before exhaustion took him. Still in his suit, his tie loosened but not removed, he woke to the sensation of something small and careful moving against his forehead. For a fraction of a second, every instinct trained into him by 12 years of survival screamed danger, and his body tensed to react. Then his mind caught up with his senses. The touch was too light, too soft, too deliberate in its gentleness to be a threat. It was the touch of a paintbrush. He kept his eyes closed. He heard Lila's breathing close to his face, the particular concentration breath of a child fully absorbed in a task. He heard the soft click of a brush being dipped and the small hum she made when she was pleased with her work. He could have opened his eyes. He could have stopped her. Instead, some instinct he did not fully understand told him to wait, to see what she would do when she believed no one was watching, when there was no adult performance required, only the truth of what a 3-year-old thought a sleeping, sad man needed. There, Lila whispered to herself. A son. Because sons make people feel better. The brush moved to his forehead, and a butterfly because butterflies go far away from sad places, across his nose in a careful arc. A rainbow because mommy says rainbows come after storms and you look like you had a big storm. Down his jaw, small dabbing motions. Freckles because freckles are fun, and I don't think you have fun very much. And finally, light as a whisper on his chin. A flower. Because flowers are for lonely people. My teacher says flowers make lonely people feel less lonely. Seo-jin lay perfectly still, his chest tight with something he could not immediately name, something that had nothing to do with the danger he had spent 12 years learning to detect, and everything to do with a sensation he had almost forgotten existed. The feeling of being cared for by someone who wanted nothing from him at all. He opened his eyes slowly. Lila was inches from his face, paintbrush poised for one more addition, her tongue poking slightly from the corner of her mouth in concentration. She startled slightly at his open eyes, but did not pull back in fear the way an adult might have, caught in the act of something forbidden. You're awake, she said simply. I am, Seo-jin said. His voice came out rougher than usual. What are you painting? You looked lonely while you were sleeping, Lila said, as though this explained everything, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. So I gave you butterflies. At that exact moment, Maya rounded the corner into the sitting room, a cup of coffee in hand for the household staff's morning rotation, and stopped dead in the doorway. The cup nearly slipped from her fingers. Leela, oh my God, Mr. Han, I am so sorry. I turned my back for 1 second. She must have gotten into my old kit. I didn't even know she still had. The words tumbled out of her in a rush of pure panic, the practiced calm she maintained in every other circumstance completely abandoned. She set the coffee down with shaking hands and crossed the room in 3 quick strides, reaching for Lila. Baby, you cannot paint on people. We've talked about this. I am so sorry, sir. I will pay for anything, I will. Seo-jin sat up slowly and turned toward the mirror mounted above the sitting room's mantel. A yellow sun bloomed on his left cheek. A wobbly blue butterfly stretched across his forehead. A rainbow, slightly crooked, arched over the bridge of his nose. Orange dots freckled his jawline in no particular pattern. A small pink flower bloomed on his chin. Han Seo-jin, feared architect of the Hanel Syndicate, a man who had removed traitors with the same composure he used to order coffee, stared at his reflection covered in a 3-year-old's watercolor artwork. And he laughed. It came from somewhere deep and unguarded. A real laugh, rough with disuse, shaking his shoulders in a way that startled him nearly as much as it startled Maya, who froze mid-apology with her mouth still open. Sir? She said, uncertain whether this was the prelude to disaster or something else entirely. I have never, Seo-jin said, still laughing, wiping at his eyes though no tears had actually formed yet, in my life worn a flower. Lila, delighted by the response she had clearly not expected but was thrilled to receive, clapped her paint-stained hands together. Do you like it? I love it, Seo-jin said, and the honesty in his voice was so unfamiliar to his own ears that it startled him into silence for a moment afterward. Maya stood frozen, watching a transformation she did not fully understand, watching 12 years of armor crack in the space of a single laugh, and felt something shift in her chest that she did not yet have a name for. He did not wash his face. Dong Juan found him in his office 40 minutes later, reviewing the morning's briefing materials with the sun still bright yellow on his cheek and the butterfly still arcing across his forehead, and to his eternal credit, Dong Juan's expression did not so much as flicker. "Sir, the 9 o'clock briefing with the underbosses is in 15 minutes. "I am aware," Seojin said, not looking up from the papers. "Would you like a moment before the meeting too, perhaps?" "No." Dong Juan closed his mouth, adjusted his tie, and said nothing further. The briefing room was already half full when Seojin entered at precisely 9 o'clock. 4 senior underbosses seated around the long black table, each of them turning to acknowledge his arrival with the customary deference. The deference lasted exactly as long as it took for each man's eyes to travel upward to his face. What followed was, in the private assessment Dong Juan would later share only with Maya, one of the most remarkable displays of professional discipline he had witnessed in his career. Min Jae-ho, seated closest to the door, blinked twice and continued reviewing his notes as though nothing whatsoever had occurred. Ryu Sungbei's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign of the enormous internal effort required to maintain composure. Han Do-yoon developed a sudden, urgent need to examine the contents of his water glass. The fourth man, an older lieutenant named Park Sun-woo, simply stared straight ahead at a point on the wall slightly above Seojin's head, his expression a masterpiece of studied neutrality. Seojin sat down at the head of the table, opened his folder, and began the meeting as though he were not wearing a rainbow across his nose. "The Busan route restructuring is proceeding on schedule," he said. "Min, your report on the warehouse consolidation." "Yes, sir." Min Jae-ho cleared his throat and began reading from his notes in a voice that trembled only slightly. "The consolidation is 70% complete. We anticipate full transition by end of month." The meeting continued in this manner for nearly 40 minutes. 4 grown men who controlled violence and money across an entire cities, discussing logistics with grave professional focus, while directly across the table sat a yellow sun, a blue butterfly, a crooked rainbow, a scatter of orange freckles, and a small pink flower, arranged on the face of the most dangerous man any of them had ever served. No one mentioned it. No one so much as glanced at it a second time, each man's professional survival instinct overriding curiosity with the discipline of soldiers trained never to question the terrain, only to navigate it. It was only at the very end of the meeting, as the underbosses gathered their papers and prepared to leave, that the youngest among them, a recently promoted lieutenant named Young Hyun-woo, who had not yet fully absorbed the culture of absolute composure, paused at the door and glanced back. "The butterfly is a good one, sir," he said, with the tentative sincerity of a young man who genuinely meant it and had decided, against every instinct of self-preservation, to say so. The room went utterly silent. Min Jae-ho's face drained of color. Dong Juan's hand drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the radio at his hip. Seojin looked up. "Yes," he said, "it is." Young Hyun-woo exhaled, nodded once, and left the room with the visible relief of a man who had gambled and won. The others filed out behind him in a hurry that suggested none of them wanted to risk being the second person to comment. Alone in the briefing room, Seojin sat for a long moment, looking at his own reflection in the polished black surface of the table, at the ghost of colors staring back at him. He thought of his father, who had died believing loyalty was worth the risk. He thought of 12 years spent proving that belief wrong. And he thought, for the first time in longer than he could measure, that perhaps something had shifted in him that he was not yet ready to name, but could no longer pretend he had not felt. The fortress was not gone, but a crack had opened, and light, however small, had found its way through. Min Jae-ho requested an unscheduled meeting 4 days later, arriving without appointment, a breach of protocol that immediately raised Dong Juan's suspicion before a single word had been exchanged. "I apologize for the informality," Min said, seated across from Seojin in the East consultation room, his hands folded with practiced calm. "But there are concerns among some of the senior men about the new treaty with the Park family. The distribution terms favor their side more than ours. Some feel the negotiation was rushed." Seojin studied him without expression. "Which men feel this way?" "I would rather not name names, sir. I am simply relaying a general sentiment. You came here without an appointment, alone, to relay a sentiment you cannot attribute to anyone specific. Min's smile flickered, just slightly. I only wanted to bring it to your attention before it became a larger issue. Noted, Seojin said. Is there anything else? No, sir. That is all. After Min departed, Seojin sat in silence for several minutes before summoning Donghwan. That was not a complaint, Seojin said. That was a probe. He wanted to see how I would respond, whether I would react with suspicion or dismiss it. Pull his contact logs, Ryu's as well, and Han Do-yoon's. Donghwan returned 2 days later with a tablet and an expression grimmer than his usual professional neutrality. All three have shown a significant increase in outgoing calls over the past 6 weeks, all to numbers registered to burner phones. The burner numbers trace, through 3 intermediary purchases, to a man named Song Do-hyun, who operates from a service department in Mapo-gu. Song has documented associations with intermediaries connected to the Daegu cartel. Seojin's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. Daegu has been quiet for 2 years. Quiet does not mean inactive, sir. It appears they have been cultivating internal dissatisfaction within our own ranks, waiting for the right moment to act. We also found something else. Donghwan hesitated, an unusual pause for a man who typically delivered information without preamble. A third guest key card was issued and used to access the East Corridor on 4 separate occasions over the past 2 months, at times when no scheduled guest was present. Security footage from one of those instances shows a woman entering the corridor. She is wearing a coat that closely resembles one belonging to Maya Brooks. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Closely resembles, Seojin repeated. The footage quality is poor, and the woman's face is not visible, but the coat is a distinctive pattern. It appears to be the same one. Seojin was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had returned to the flat, controlled register that had governed his life for 12 years. The voice he used when he was preparing himself to do something he did not want to do. Find out everything, he said. Everything. I want to know if Daegu has placed an asset in my house. The evidence, when Donghwan finished compiling it 3 days later, was devastating in the way only carefully constructed lies can be devastating. Each individual piece plausible, and the accumulation nearly undeniable. Maya Brooks has a documented calling pattern, with 3 numbers linked to Song Do-hyun's network. Donghwan reported, laying printed logs across Seojin's desk with the precision of a man delivering a verdict he did not want to deliver. The calls began 9 weeks before she started employment here, before she had even been placed with our household. One of the numbers is registered as belonging to her original placement agency's scheduling coordinator, but that number was reassigned 4 months ago to a burner associated with Song's network. He pulled up a second document. The camera footage of the coat matches the timeline of one of her documented sick days, when she claimed to be caring for Lila at home. Her phone's location data for that day shows a gap of approximately 90 minutes, consistent with travel time to and from the Mapo-gu apartment. Seojin studied the documents in silence, his face unreadable, though something cold had settled behind his eyes. She was vetted, he said finally. Clean background, good references. An agency contact who identifies vulnerable candidates months in advance would know exactly how to construct a background that passes vetting, Donghwan said. Foreign national, financially fragile, desperate for stability, isolated from family support. She would make an ideal unwitting asset, or a willing one under enough pressure. Either way, the pattern fits. Seojin closed the folder slowly. He thought of Lila's small hand pressing a paintbrush to his forehead. He thought of the butterfly, the rainbow, the flower for lonely people. He thought of Maya's careful, disciplined silence in the face of a dangerous man's household, her refusal to ask questions she had no right to ask. Had all of it been performance? Had the child been a tool, deployed with devastating effectiveness to open a door that 12 years of vigilance had kept sealed? The thought made something in his chest curdle with a feeling he recognized immediately, because he had felt it once before 12 years ago in a restaurant bathroom while his father bled out on the tile. Betrayal. Sir, Donghwan said carefully, watching the shift in his expression. What do you want to do? Seojin was silent for a long moment. Every instinct trained into him over 12 years screamed at him to act immediately, to remove the threat before it could do further damage, to treat the evidence as conclusive because evidence had always been conclusive before, because hesitation was the exact mechanism that had gotten his father killed. But he found himself thinking of something else, too. Something Lila had said, weeks ago, with the fearless honesty of a child who had never learned to calculate her words. You have tired eyes. No one had ever looked at him and seen only that he was tired. Everyone calculated, everyone performed, except, perhaps, a 3-year-old who did not yet know how to lie, and a mother who had never once, in 14 months of employment, asked him for anything she was not owed. I will question her myself, he said, before anything else happens. Sir, with respect, the evidence. I am aware of the evidence, Don Juan. I built this organization on the principle of never trusting blindly. That principle does not only apply to trusting people, it also applies to trusting evidence that arrives conveniently packaged and points in exactly the direction someone wants me to look. Don Juan said nothing, but something in his expression suggested he had not considered this angle and was now turning it over with new attention. He found her in the kitchen the next morning, preparing breakfast with the same careful efficiency she brought to everything. Lila seated at the small table nearby with a coloring book, humming to herself. Maya, Seojin said, I need to speak with you, alone. Something in his tone made her set down the knife she had been using immediately. She glanced at Lila, then back at him, and he saw the calculation happen behind her eyes. The swift, practiced assessment of a woman who had learned to read danger quickly because her survival and her daughters had depended on it. Dong Juan can watch her, Seojin said, and Dong Juan, who had been waiting in the corridor, stepped in without needing to be asked twice. They moved to the East Consultation Room, the same room where Min Jae-ho had delivered his probe days earlier. Maya sat across from him, spine straight, hands folded, her face composed into the careful neutrality she had maintained since her first day. Tell me about Atlanta, Seojin said. I've told you the general story already. Tell me the specific one. Maya was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, though something beneath it carried an old, worn exhaustion. Leela's father, Marcus, borrowed money from people who don't send lawyers when payments are late. When he disappeared, actually, not just left. The debt didn't disappear with him. It came to me because I was the one still there, still findable. I had about 6 weeks between the day I understood how serious it was and the day I got on a plane. I chose South Korea because it was as far from Atlanta as I could get on the salary I had, and because the placement agency had a fast track for certified domestic staff willing to relocate internationally. How did you find the agency? A woman at a job placement event. She said she specialized in matching American domestic staff with international households, mostly in Seoul and Tokyo. She gave me a card. A woman named. Maya paused, searching her memory. CO, I don't remember her first name. She was polished, professional. She said the placement fee would be waived if I accepted a household within 90 days. Seojin's expression did not change, but internally, something clicked into place with the cold precision of a lock turning. After you were placed, did this woman remain in contact? She gave me a coordinator line for scheduling issues, sick days, complaints. I called it maybe 5 or 6 times over the past year. Once when Lila had a fever and I needed to report an absence in advance. Once when I had a question about a contract renewal. Seojin slid the phone log across the table. Do you recognize these numbers? Maya studied the list, and her brow furrowed with genuine confusion. Not the performed confusion of someone caught, but the real disorientation of someone encountering a puzzle they did not understand. This one, yes, that's the coordinator line. This one, I don't recognize this one. I've never called this number. Our records show 3 calls placed from your registered phone to this number over the past 2 months. That's not possible. I would remember. I don't call unfamiliar numbers. I don't have the minutes to waste. She looked up at him, and for the first time something like fear entered her expression. Not fear of him, but the dawning fear of a woman realizing the ground beneath her had shifted without her knowledge. What is this about? There is a woman named Song. No, Seo Mirei. Does that name mean anything to you? That might be her, the agency contact. I only ever knew her as Monsieur Seo. Seojin was quiet for a long moment. I believe your agency contact identified you as a candidate months before you were placed here, specifically because you were foreign, financially desperate, and isolated. I believe she has been using your normal scheduling calls to construct a pattern that makes you appear to be feeding information to a rival organization. There is footage of a woman wearing a coat matching yours entering an apartment linked to that organization, on a day you reported as a sick day at home with Lila. Maya's face went pale, but her voice, when she spoke, remained level, the discipline of a woman who had learned, through hard necessity, never to let panic take the wheel. Someone built the evidence around me. Yes, Seojin said. Are we in danger? Not yet. The two words hung in the room, and Maya understood, with the clarity of someone accustomed to reading exactly what was said and what was withheld, that not yet was not the same as no. She did not cry, she did not plead. She sat up straighter, met his eyes directly, and said, "Tell me what you need from us." Seo-jin studied her for a long moment. The steadiness of her hands, the absence of theater in her fear, the immediate pivot from personal terror to practical usefulness, and felt something settle in him that he did not fully understand yet. Something that felt, against every instinct 12 years had trained into him, like trust. "We are going to use the channel they built," Seo-jin said, once Dong-hwan had joined them and the full plan had been laid out on the table. "If Seo Mi-rae believes you remain an unknowing asset, we can feed her information that draws her and Song Do-hyun into confirming their own operation." "You want me to call the number," Maya said. "Under our direction, you will report a schedule that does not exist, a supposed transfer of sensitive documents through the estate on a specific night. Information valuable enough that Daegu will move to confirm or exploit it. We will be watching every step. And Lila, move to a secured guest room, with Dong-hwan's team stationed at every access point. She will not leave your sight for longer than necessary, and never without supervision." Maya was silent for a moment, weighing the plan with the same careful precision she brought to every decision that touched her daughter's safety. "If this goes wrong, it will not go wrong," Seo-jin said, and something in his voice, flat and absolutely certain, made her believe him despite every reason she had to doubt a man she had known for barely 4 months. The call was made 2 days later, in the security office under Dong-hwan's direct supervision, with a recording line active, and 3 additional men monitoring signal traces in real time. Maya dialed the number she had been given as a routine scheduling contact, her voice perfectly level, betraying none of the tension coiled through every muscle in her body. "Hi, it's Maya Brooks. I wanted to give you an update on the household schedule, since you asked me to flag anything unusual." She recited the fabricated details exactly as instructed. A supposed document transfer, a specific night, a specific guarded route through the estate that did not in reality exist. "I just thought I should mention it, in case it affects my hours that week." "Thank you for letting us know," came the reply, a woman's voice, smooth and professional. "We appreciate you keeping us updated. Is there anything else unusual happening in the household?" "Not that I've noticed. Everything's been normal." "Good. Take care, Maya." The call ended. Maya set the phone down and exhaled slowly, her hands finally beginning to tremble now that the performance was complete. That was her, Dong-hwan confirmed, reviewing the voice match against a sample pulled from an old agency recruitment video. Seo Mi-rae. Seo-jin, who had stood silently at the back of the room through the entire call, watching Maya's composure hold steady, even as her fingers had gone white against the edge of the desk, felt something crystallize in him with total clarity. She had done everything asked of her, under threat to her own child, without a single crack in her control. Whatever Seo Mi-rae had built, whatever lies had been constructed around her, Maya Brooks was not the traitor in this house. She was, and had always been, exactly what her file had said, a woman trying to build stability for her daughter in a world that had given her very little of it. "You did well," Seo-jin said quietly, once Dong-hwan had left to coordinate the surveillance response. Maya looked up at him, exhaustion and fear and something like grim determination all visible in her face at once. "I need my daughter safe. That's the only thing I did well for." "She will be," Seo-jin said. "I give you my word." It was the first time, in 14 months of employment, that he had offered her his word about anything at all, and something in the weight of it settled between them, unspoken but understood. While the operation unfolded in careful, controlled stages over the following days, Lila noticed what every child eventually notices in a house full of grown-up tension, that the doors had begun closing again. She found Dong-hwan in the corridor outside Seo-jin's office, standing guard with his usual unreadable expression, and tugged at his sleeve until he crouched down to her level, a courtesy he extended to almost no one else in the estate. "He's sad again," Lila said, nodding toward the closed office door. "Mr. Han is very busy right now," Dong-hwan said carefully. "People close doors when their hearts get noisy," Lila said, with the strange, unearned wisdom that sometimes surfaces in small children who have absorbed more from the adults around them than anyone realizes. "My mommy used to close her door a lot in our old apartment. Before we came here," Dong-hwan, who had spent 12 years perfecting an expression of total professional neutrality, found himself entirely unprepared for the small, direct honesty of a 3-year-old's grief observation, and simply nodded, unsure what else to offer. That afternoon, Lila spent nearly 2 hours on a single painting, more focused than Maya had ever seen her, her small tongue poking from the corner of her mouth in the particular concentration she reserved for work she considered important. When she finished, she carried it, still slightly damp, to Donghuan, who happened to be the only adult available at that moment. The painting showed a black tiger, its stripes rendered in careful, deliberate strokes, standing just outside the doorway of a bright yellow room. Inside the room, butterflies floated in every color Lila owned, suspended in mid-air against the yellow backdrop like something out of a dream. "The tiger is not bad," Lila explained, before Donghuan had even asked. "He just forgot how to come inside." Donghuan looked at the painting for a long moment, and something in his carefully composed face shifted, just slightly, in a way that would have surprised anyone who had worked with him for less than a decade. He brought the painting to Seojin's office that evening, setting it on the desk without explanation, and left before Seojin could ask any questions. Seojin sat alone with the painting for a long time after Donghuan had gone. He looked at the black tiger, standing at the threshold of a room full of color and light, close enough to see everything inside but unable, or unwilling, to cross the doorway. He understood, with a clarity that felt almost unbearable, exactly what she had painted and exactly who she had painted it of. The trap closed 3 nights later. Surveillance teams positioned around the Mapo-gu serviced apartment confirmed movement consistent with a response to the fabricated document transfer. Song Do-hyun making calls, coordinating what appeared to be an attempted interception, communicating directly with Seo Mi-rae in a conversation Donghuan's team recorded in full. The recording, played back in the estate's security office the following morning, confirmed everything. "The maid's information checks out," Song Do-hyun's voice said, tinny through the recording equipment. "Same source as always, reliable timing. We move on the transfer window she gave us." "Good," Seo Mi-rae's voice replied. "I told them she'd be useful. Desperate people always are. She has no idea what her scheduling calls have actually been building toward. As far as she knows, she's just talking to a coordinator about sick days." The confirmation was absolute. Maya had never known. She had been identified months before her placement, specifically because her vulnerability made her believable, specifically because a woman desperate to protect her daughter would answer every call from what she believed was a legitimate agency contact without question, never suspecting that her routine, mundane conversations were being woven into the fabric of a fabricated espionage pattern. She had been insurance, not an asset, a scapegoat constructed in advance in case the Daegu cartel's deeper infiltration, Min Jae-ho, Ryu Sung-bae, and Han Do-yoon, all quietly cultivated toward eventual betrayal, was ever discovered. If Seojin's suspicion ever turned inward, Maya would have been there, conveniently guilty, deflecting attention from the real traitors embedded in his own ranks. Seojin listened to the recording twice, his face utterly still, and when it finished, he said only one word to Donghuan: "Move." What followed was executed with the same cold precision that had defined every action of Seojin's 12-year reign. There was no theatrical cruelty, no dramatic confrontation staged for effect. Access credentials for Min Jae-ho, Ryu Sung-bae, and Han Do-yoon were severed simultaneously, their accounts frozen, their territories reassigned before any of them fully understood what was happening. Evidence of Song Do-hyun's operation, carefully curated to protect the organization's own less legal dealings, was routed to contacts within the police department who owed Seojin favors substantial enough to guarantee thorough follow-through. Seo Mi-rae's placement agency was quietly dismantled, its licenses revoked, its remaining operations absorbed into legitimate competitors who had no knowledge of what it had actually been. No one died. No one disappeared into the kind of silence that had once defined how the Haniel Syndicate handled betrayal. Seojin had built his empire on precision rather than rage, and even now, with a plot against his own household fully exposed, he adhered to the principle that had governed him for 12 years. Consequences should be permanent, but they did not need to be cruel to be effective. By the end of the week, the threat that had briefly threatened to unravel everything was gone, dismantled from the inside out, and Maya Brooks had been proven, beyond any doubt, exactly what she had always claimed to be. He found her in the west sitting room 2 evenings later, after Lila had fallen asleep in the guest room down the hall, the household finally quiet in the particular way it settled after a crisis had passed. "I owe you an explanation," Seojin said, standing in the doorway. Maya looked up from the chair where she had been sitting, watching the rain against the reinforced glass. "You don't owe me anything. You protected us." "I suspected you," he said, and the admission cost him something visible, a rare crack in the composure he had maintained for 12 years. The evidence was constructed carefully enough that most men in my position would have acted on it without question. I have removed people from this organization on far less certainty than what was presented against you. But you didn't. No, I chose to question you first. Maya was quiet for a moment, studying him with the same careful, assessing eyes she had used since her very first day in his house. "I know what you are, Mr. Hahn. I've cleaned this house for 14 months. I've seen the locked rooms and the armed men and the cars that come at midnight and leave before dawn. I'm not naive about what happens behind those closed doors. I'm not asking you to become something safe. I am not a simple situation," he said. "I never will be." "I'm not asking for simple," Maya said. "I've never had simple. I wouldn't know what to do with it." "Then what are you asking for?" She held his gaze steadily, the same directness that had first made him notice her, months ago, without quite understanding why. "Honesty. Whatever this house is, whatever danger comes with it, I need to know the truth of what I'm walking into, so I can protect my daughter properly. I don't need you to lie to me to make things feel safer than they are." Seo-jin considered this for a long moment, the rain drumming steadily against the glass behind him. "I can do that." It was not a promise of safety. It was not a declaration of anything resembling romance, not yet, not in the way stories usually demanded. It was something smaller and more honest than that. Two people who had both learned, through hard experience, that trust given carelessly could get you killed. Agreeing to build something slowly, deliberately, on a foundation of truth rather than performance. "Thank you," Maya said, and for the first time since she had arrived at the estate, something in her posture loosened, just slightly. The vigilance she carried everywhere easing by a fraction that only someone watching very closely would have noticed. Seo-jin noticed. 3 weeks later, Dong-won found Seo-jin in the storage room at the end of the east corridor, sleeves rolled up, surrounded by boxes he had personally cleared out over the course of 2 days, a paint roller in one hand, and a streak of pale yellow across his forearm. "Sir," Dong-won said carefully, taking in the scene with the same studied neutrality he had once deployed during the butterfly briefing. "Is there something I can assist with?" "No," Seo-jin said, running the roller unevenly across the wall, leaving a visible seam where 2 coats had not quite blended. "I am handling this myself." Dong-hwan glanced at the uneven paint job, the easel already assembled in the corner, the boxes of watercolor sets and thick paper and crayons stacked neatly against one wall, the small stack of picture books about butterflies he had personally ordered from 3 different online retailers because he could not decide which selection was most appropriate. "Understood, sir," Dong-hwan said, and left without further comment, though something in his expression just before the door closed suggested he understood exactly what he had witnessed. The room took Seo-jin 4 more days to finish, working in fragments of time stolen between meetings and negotiations, refusing help from staff who offered, insisting on completing the uneven, imperfect paint job himself, layer by layer, until the walls glowed the soft, warm yellow of sunlight through morning curtains, the same yellow Lila used every single time for the sun in her paintings. He brought her to the room on a Saturday morning, Maya trailing a few steps behind, curious and slightly wary about what he had been so secretively constructing for the past week. Lila stood in the doorway, her small hand still in Seo-jin's, and stared at the room with an expression of pure, uncomplicated wonder. The easel, the paints, the butterfly books, the yellow walls that glowed like sunlight had been poured directly onto the plaster. "Is this for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might make it disappear. "For your butterflies," Seo-jin said. Lila let go of his hand and ran into the room, immediately climbing onto the small stool positioned at the easel, reaching for the closest set of paints with the singular joy of a child who had just discovered something she considered entirely magical. Maya stood in the doorway, watching, and felt something in her chest tighten with an emotion too complicated to name in a single word: gratitude. And something warmer than gratitude, and underneath it all, a quiet, dawning recognition that this was not a gift purchased to buy her daughter's affection or her own loyalty. This was a dangerous man, a man who had built his entire life on suspicion and control, standing in an unevenly painted yellow room with a paint roller stain still visible on his forearm, trying awkwardly and honestly to make space for light in a fortress that had never allowed any in before. You painted it yourself, she said quietly. The seams are uneven, Seojin admitted. I have never painted a wall in my life. It's perfect, Maya said, and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the quality of the paint job. Lila, already absorbed in her first painting on the new easel, looked up briefly. Come see. Seojin crossed the room and crouched beside her, looking at the fresh sheet of paper where a wobbly yellow sun had already taken shape. It's the room, Lila explained. The sun is because it's happy in here now. Seojin looked at the painting, then at the room around him, at Maya standing in the doorway with an expression he was only beginning to let himself understand, and felt, for the first time in 12 years, that perhaps the fortress he had built to survive betrayal did not have to remain entirely sealed. Perhaps a window, carefully placed, chosen deliberately rather than forced open by circumstance, was not weakness at all. Perhaps it was simply what surviving well, rather than merely surviving, actually required. Han Seojin had built a fortress to survive betrayal. He had locked every door, tested every loyalty, and taught himself that loneliness was the price of power, a debt he paid without complaint because he believed, with total conviction, that it was the only alternative to the fate that had taken his father. Then a 3-year-old girl painted butterflies on the face of the most feared man in Seoul and proved that even a fortress can have windows. He did not become safe. He did not become simple. The rooms in his estate remained locked. For good reason, the guards remained at the gates. The business of his empire continued in the same careful, dangerous rhythm it always had. But when Maya Brooks asked him for honesty, he gave it, and in giving it, discovered that trust, offered slowly and deliberately rather than blindly, was not the same weakness that had killed his father. It was something else entirely. Something earned, brick by brick, the way the fortress itself had been built. And in a yellow room filled with crayons, apple juice, stuffed animals, and butterflies, the Mafia Boss learned that trust was not weakness. It was the one risk still worth taking. Would you have trusted Maya when all the evidence made her look guilty? And what would you have done if a toddler painted butterflies on the face of a Mafia Boss? Comment your answer below. If you love emotional Mafia stories, single mother drama, powerful children, and cold men learning how to feel again, like this video, share it, and subscribe for more cinematic stories.